think it's going to be a really exciting discussion today, a very interesting discussion on community engaged learning in Canada. And so I'd just like to thank you all for being here. The title of our session today is Encouraging Community-Driven Research and Learning Programs on Campus. And I'll be the facilitator, moderator of today's event. My name is Amber Fletcher. I'm an associate professor of sociology and social studies at the University of Regina. And I'm also the academic director of the University of Regina's Community Engagement and Research Center, or CERC for short. This event has been organized jointly by CERC at the U of R, as well as Community Campus Engage Canada. And I'd just like to welcome the co-organizers, the co-researchers on this project. We have Dr. Magda Gomans and Dr. Lynn Gidluck. So Lynn and Magda, if you want to just wave. Lynn is the community director of CERC, and Magda is the manager of CCE Canada, Community Campus Engage Canada. So I will be introducing our wonderful panelists in just a few moments, but just give you a bit of background on what today's session is all about. Today we will be sharing some learnings from a research project that the three of us have been leading for about the last year, a little over a year. So we started this project in late 2020. And the study that we've been involved with was really designed to support and assist the University of Regina in developing a campus-wide focus on integrating community-driven, meaningful reciprocal community engaged learning, or CEL, into our undergraduate courses. So we launched this large-scale research project, which involves a case study at U of R, but also a pan-Canadian component as well. And at the end of this session, we'll be sharing some preliminary, just basic initial insights from some of the data that we've been collecting through this project. And the information from this project will be shared widely by CCE Canada across its networks, across its knowledge sharing community. And the goal, of course, is not only to inform community engaged learning at my own institution, the U of R, but also to inspire others across the country who may be looking to implement CEL more broadly or more meaningfully into its academic programming. So in the chat, I believe Magda is going to be posting some things in the chat. There will be a link to just a brief summary of our project. And for background, just some terminology notes. When we talk about community engaged learning, or CEL, we're talking about the various opportunities that exist for students to apply what they're learning in a post-secondary context, so in their classes, by supporting the efforts of a community-based organization. And one form of CEL, which I'm sure we've all heard of, is community service learning, or CSL, where students apply the concepts they've learned in the classroom setting to meet community-defined objectives. And that coursework usually involves deep reflection on their experiences in the community as well. So CEL, community engaged learning, involves students, faculty, community partners working together collaboratively for mutual benefit, which is aimed toward meaningful community impact and greater awareness of civic responsibility and social justice. So with that in mind, I'll move forward to just give a brief summary of how our session will be structured today. So the majority of our webinar will be focused on our three panelists. We're very pleased and honored to have three very experienced, very knowledgeable practitioners of community engaged learning from both Canada and the United States. So I will be posing a set of questions to each of our three panelists. Each of them will respond in turn to my question, and then we'll move on to the next question. Each of the panelists will then respond in turn to that question, and so forward. And we'll see how many questions we can cover with the time we have available today. After the discussion with the panelists, I'll be providing a very brief summary of some of those initial findings coming out of our project. And hopefully that will take about 5 minutes. After that, we will have a Q&A with all of the attendees. So you'll be welcome to bring your own questions. When we start the Q&A session, you're welcome to put up your hand if you'd like to just ask a question verbally. That's totally fine. Or you can put your question in the chat if you prefer. So that is our plan for the day. I'm now very, very excited to introduce our panelists. We have with us today Mary Sweetman, who is an associate professor of community development at Acadia University. So Mary, if you just making sure I can see you, if you can just give a wave. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Sweetman. And we also have with us Chelsea Lauder, who is the Community Engaged Teaching and Research Program Manager from Northeastern University in the United States. So welcome, Chelsea, and if you can give a wave for us. Thank you so much. And then we also have Dr. Cynthia Alexander, who's a professor in the Department of Politics at Acadia University. Welcome, Cynthia, and I'll get you to give a wave as well. Thank you so much. So the full biographies, the very, very impressive biographies of our three panelists are going to be placed in the chat. So I'm hoping you can see those in front of you right now. And with that being said, are we ready to move on to the discussion of the panelists? Okay, I'm just going to keep an eye on the chat here as well, just in case there's any questions along the way. You're welcome to add your questions into the chat at any point, and then of course we can take them up in the Q&A session. So I would like to begin with my questions for the panelists. We'll mix up the order a little bit here. In this case, I'll start with Mary, then move to Cynthia, then to Chelsea, and then I'll mix up the order for the next questions. So the first question is, could you please describe how you've been involved in community engaged learning at your institution, including any community campus partnerships that you've been particularly proud to support? So kind of a general overview of your activities with CEL, and I'll turn to Dr. Sweetman first.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. And I guess I just want to start with that I think we're gathering from all over Turtle Island, and that myself and a few other people on this call are in Mi'kma'ki, which is the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And I want to begin with that because I think it's really important in my community engaged practice and learning that I always remember and ground myself in where I am and the privileges that I have been afforded that have not been to other people working on a campus, such as Acadia University in rural Nova Scotia. And so I really appreciate the question around like, where do I intersect with this and how does this become part of my practice? And when I started at Acadia University, I teach in a program called community development. And so all, from first years to fourth years, we're engaging our students in community. And I was thrown right into doing community engaged learning. And I quickly said, oh my goodness, I don't know if this is benefiting the community. I was like, what's the literature? What do we know about this? How do I do this appropriately? And at that time, I had just started my PhD and I was teaching full time and had little people at home that I was caring for. And I decided that maybe what the best way to carry on with my research was to research what I was doing in the classroom. And I quickly learned that there was lots of evidence that this is great for the students and that we haven't researched as well if it's good for the community. And so then I started my journey around action research, particularly a framing of feminist action research, looking at, does community engaged learning benefit the community? How, why, what are the components? And so I think that's really driven my work over the last 10 years, always kind of coming back to that question, always being interested, questioning what I am doing with students within community. And I think just very briefly, some of the most important engagement opportunities that I have had revolve around long-term partnerships. So when I've been able to invest lots of time and energy into community organizations as a citizen first. So something I learned early on was, engaging myself in my work as a citizen of my community. And so the local place really matters in my work. And then helping my students also see that they are part of these places, citizens first. And I think that has really driven my work around making sure that when we're doing this work, we are looking at power, we're looking at equity, we're looking at accessibility. And that, I'm really driven by the opportunity to become or to work in relationship with people. And so a few of the long-term partnerships that I've had are with Kentville Recreation, with the local farmers market that does a lot of work around equity in our area, and then also some moms groups. So as a young mom, when I first moved here, I gravitated towards working with moms, particularly low income and moms who have trouble accessing programs. And so for the last 10 years, I've worked really closely with that group and have then created action research projects that involve them, involve my students, and so forth. So these are long-term relationships. And so maybe I'll just stop there saying that those are a couple of the components that are really important to me in my work.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm looking forward to hearing more about those partnerships and the citizens approach that you're taking. So thank you. Over to you, Cynthia.
Thank you. It's interesting that it's my community-based and community-driven research relationships that informed my community service learning initiatives. I've been doing community engaged learning for almost 25 years. And when I think back, thanks to your question of what have I done? What have we done? And I remember the first one actually didn't have a partner. Instead, it was a community engaged learning initiative that responded to a quick federal election call in 2000. And I said to students in my intro politics class, do you want to go for a ride? Do you want to change things up? And they said yes. And so we did. And one of the things back in 2000 was that there wasn't much attention given to women running for in the federal election, nor to women's issues. So a group of intro politics students created a website for national consumption that they called Can Win E2000, the Canadian Women's Issues Network for Election 2000. And they covered everything. And they garnered national and international attention. And as a result of that term-long project, in addition to all the traditional learning that we were doing, they appeared on the first national town hall on CBC, our public broadcaster. So that was my first dive in, and I could see that it made a difference. And in the last 20 some years, my students have had the opportunity to work with those at the heart of the federal government in the Treasury Board Secretariat. They've worked for the Commissioner of Nunavut, the equivalent role of Lieutenant Governor. And given what Mary said, they've also worked for the local Women's Transition House, Chrysalis House, where they listened to their partner, and over the course of the term, a group in a large class of 60 worked to design a new website for that organization and a DVD, an online video for people who might be coming into the shelter and wanted to know what to expect. I also, starting in 2005, because of my research, listened to Inuit of Nunavut in the Eastern Arctic about what they said were their top research priorities. And yes, housing crisis, yes, food insecurity, but the top priority was reconnecting Inuit youth with elders. And so I had the opportunity to take students, thanks to major research grants, up to Nunavut. And I think when I consider how my students have worked for Indigenous peoples in the last 15 or so years, including local First Nations peoples, it's the partnership, the sustained partnership with Inuit that I'm most proud of. Partly because when we think of Community Campus Engage Canada, even though we now say Canada coast to coast to coast, too often we're still ignoring and marginalizing northern communities. And so this last fall, I did a number of large community-driven service learning projects, including with a local First Nation, but also did one with Inuit of Nunavut that was strictly online. And it had the most profound impact on students and on communities with whom we partnered in Nunavut beyond what I could have imagined, which is pretty common. I don't know how much more time I have, but I'm certainly happy to talk about why that was such a profound experience and how being nimble and flexible and adaptive as one is in respectful relationships is what can take you on a great decolonizing journey that allows students and myself to exercise and grow our civic muscle.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. And I think I hope there will be an opportunity to discuss that further, that adaptability that you speak of. So over to Chelsea. And again, Chelsea, so a summary of your involvement with CEL and something that you're particularly proud of.
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. It's nice to meet many of you. So my work at Northeastern University in Boston is almost at the intersection of the faculty and the researchers like Cynthia and Mary who want to do this work, but don't know where to start. And so our university is a Research One, very large university in a urban area. However, the campus sits on existing communities that had community leaders and have community leaders and community driven change happening. And so my community engaged learning work is really in facilitating for experts at the university, so people who teach in their particular discipline, how they can build ethical relationships, responsible relationships in community toward generating social change at the same time as developing opportunities for Northeastern students to enhance their learning. I feel really lucky to be at that intersection, especially as a younger scholar in the field. I feel like I've learned a lot from people who have been doing the disciplinary work and like they see the opportunities and are just looking for the support and how to facilitate that responsibly and in various ways. So I think one thing that I've really been proud of in my work, specifically in developing community partnerships, is this ability to build trust and in a lot of ways try to build pathways for healing, because I mean, I sit at a large university that has gentrified a lot of the communities in which our nonprofit partners and other community-based partners are situated. And so building that trust and those pathways of healing so that there's opportunities for our students and our faculty to support the ongoing work of these community leaders. I think typically a lot of the partners that we've worked with have been fairly established nonprofits who are looking for volunteers for a series of time, which is in alignment with our fairly robust community service learning course program, of which we have about 50 to 60 that run across the institution. So that's about 2,000 students who are engaging in community every academic year solely through their coursework. And one thing that we've really seen shift is that our partners aren't just those larger nonprofits who are looking for those kind of one-off volunteers to support in whatever time they're in that class, but a lot of neighborhood associations, a lot of kind of solo community organizers who are looking to leverage the power and the support of universities such as Northeastern and the others that are in and around Boston, to the point where we work with a lot of small businesses that surround campus and have kind of expanded beyond just those established nonprofit partners to build more of a network rather than specific partnerships that serve one purpose. And so the community engaged learning work that I do, I teach a first year seminar for students who are undeclared at the university, so who are doing their personal exploration, and work specifically with a mutual aid organization right next to campus that is working around food justice and food waste. And so I see a lot of the components of trust building and the components of relationship building manifesting in that particular partnership.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. Thank you all for your answers to my first question. I think you'll probably all have a lot to say about the second question as well, because we know that community engaged learning is not without its challenges. And so my next question for each of you is, what do you find most challenging within community campus partnerships? And how have you responded to those challenges? So I think this time I'm going to start with Cynthia, and then I'll move to Chelsea, and then Mary third. So Cynthia.
Most challenging. Given that you've heard that a lot of the work that I do is with and for Indigenous peoples coast to coast to coast, certainly one of the most pressing concerns that I hold and look to mitigate is that when my students get the benefit of time with an Indigenous elder, leader, youth, and other community members, it's taking time away from urgent issues in the community, in families, in their nations. And I found a number of ways to, to move beyond that. Perhaps the most, so putting that aside, one of the most challenging issues I faced about 8 years ago, before the term settler was common. I was using a term called unsettling the settler within. I remember in around 2014, and students in a senior seminar class who we now would call settlers like myself were just so troubled and bothered by that term. And so one of the most community engaged learning can be exciting, it can be exhilarating, it can be empowering, and we know it can be impactful, but it can also be exhausting on multiple levels of being, partly because one's doing the difficult work of unlearning. And students, I remember I had a graduate student in class who said, I'm here to learn, and I'm learning how much I have to unlearn, and was in tears at how much she didn't know that was a prerequisite to moving forward, and how much she knew that were myths and misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies. And so that was challenging. And so with a research collaborator and fellow policy analyst, we created an applied framework for a visual framework for the decolonizing journey that we call the D² framework. And I won't get into it a lot here. We co-authored an article that's in the Journal of Character Education, volume 17, I think, that gives a bit of insight into what it is. But it's a visual journey that takes us from the default mode up into deliberative democracy, and it's an upward journey with 4 stages and 12 steps. And students, we designed it primarily for students, and they found it extraordinarily helpful to understand that the default mode of colonialism, one can get stuck there. It can be more comfortable. It also is really difficult to get out of. There's a lot of hard work to do to make that leap from being aware of to being interested in, recognizing that one can have an understanding of Indigenous knowledge, but not have a connection with. So I see that's one way that I dealt with the challenge. The second way is because it's exhausting on multiple levels, I brought in the fact that I'm a yoga and Pilates instructor. And so we've introduced mindfulness into my courses. And I just wrote about that in a chapter in a new book that I've co-authored or co-edited called Leadership, Wellness, and Mental Health and Education. So just very succinctly, those are some of the problems and a couple ways that we've worked to grapple with them.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. And Chelsea, your challenges and how you've responded.
Yeah, I think I'll speak from almost the 3 perspectives that I see in my work. So from a faculty perspective, or from an educator or researcher perspective, a lot of the challenges are, as I alluded to, they often don't know where to start. And so that turns into either never starting anything until they get to a point of like, okay, now I'm ready to do this. Like, give me what I'm looking for type approach to setting up partnerships, or this idea of I'm ready, I want to do this, who do I ask, how do I ask them? And so the challenges around really building partnerships from the ground up and having trust be a central component of that, being in a relationship as humans and not just as people who are looking to get something out of it. I think figuring out the balance between personal priorities, professional priorities with wanting to do it well. And I say that because doing it well is so subjective and really difficult and dependent on who the collaborators and the partners are. Simultaneously, I think from a community partner perspective, a huge challenge is the power dynamic of higher ed institutions and where knowledge is stored, how knowledge is communicated as being right or being the best type of knowledge. And so I see a lot of challenges with community partners knowing or wanting to know that they are experts in what they're doing. They are maybe just looking for additional support and capacity building and how they're doing that, and see universities as a pathway to building that capacity. But then the challenges of how you kind of stand in those partnerships as knowing that you have the power, but finding balance between that, I think, is what I'm trying to say around partners. I see a lot of challenge in that. And then simultaneously, as a person who facilitates both sides, this understanding of how do you bring people together for something beyond just a partnership or beyond just a single purpose or a project. And so I saw a question in the chat around like, what are the activities and events to do this? That's really hard to answer sometimes because there's a lot of different things that you can do. But one challenge is often like supporting the prioritization of partnership building in campus and community spaces. And I think another challenge that at least I definitely face as a staff member, again, facilitating this type of work, is not gatekeeping the partnerships. I think we care so deeply about the people that we interact and that we collaborate with, to the point where we almost don't want to let people make mistakes because we recognize the harm that is associated with those mistakes. And so I think, Cynthia, you said it really well at one point, this like adaptability, the flexibility, the way to allow for those interactions to be fluid in a lot of ways, is not always the easiest thing to do in this work when we care so much and you're consistently trying to show that care in a way that your partners are looking for it.
Thank you, Chelsea. I think Cynthia and Chelsea's comments just go beautifully together around this theme of being reflexive and kind of thinking critically and carefully about our role in all of this. So thank you. Mary, your turn.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree that, but I don't want to repeat what has already been said, but agree. So I'll just try to add on with the thought that like I agree with what has been said. So maybe I'll give some more like practical challenges that come with this work. Money is a challenge, and so if we, I think a lot about what is fair wages for students. Someone put a question in the chat there about engaging graduate students and undergraduate students. Teaching assistants become a really important part of my practice, and I think it's a really an amazing leadership opportunity. But what is a fair wage for a teaching assistant, and then also fair wage or fair compensation for the community partner and what they're doing and not taking advantage of community knowledge. So just a shout out to Clary Ray McNeil's on this call, and in Nova Scotia, Clary has been able to fund a lot of action research in very manageable reporting ways. Thanks. But there are a lot of grants that I've applied for that take a ton of time. And so this money piece, this time piece, resources, these all also impact my personal ability to be able to do this engagement well with praxis, with dialogue, with reflexivity, in long-term relationship. We're a semester-based program, and so if the students are just engaged for 4 months, I have a very different timeline than maybe the community partner does, and being able to be flexible and adaptable within that, like both of the other panelists have talked about. The other one that I'll mention, and then I won't say anymore, is issues around the system in which we work with that often silos our departments and disciplines. And if we could find better ways to work together and cross-disciplinary and cross-sectorally, I think we could affect change and mobilize transformation. And so I think that's a institutional colonial issue that we often are met with, that inhibits our ability to do this work really well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mary. I'm seeing a lot of connection between the preliminary findings that are coming from our research project on this and many of the things that are being said. So it's all coming together. I have one more question for the three of you, and I think our timing is going perfectly. So I want to thank you for that. My third question, this time I will start with Chelsea and then Mary and then Cynthia. And the question is, do you have any advice about how to effectively connect with a community-based organization for a research or learning partnership? So I think this, there's also some questions in the chat that are similar to this, but this one is all about how you make that initial connection. So we'll start with Chelsea.
Definitely. So I think my first advice is in really any networking situation, like try to figure out who else might be working with an organization, who you might know, who might know somebody. I think that there's a lot to be said about personal relationships as a starting point for building these types of partnerships. But then in addition to that, I really cannot say it or think about it enough, but don't go to somebody for something, for wanting to start a partnership at the moment that you need them. The sentiment that partnerships are relationships and they're a give and take, and that there's a lot to be said about the nature of those interactions. And so you can't build trust unless you've spent the time doing that. And so being okay with that is really important. And in response to one of the questions in the chat, and kind of another thing more generally, is when you're at an institution, there can often be red tape. There's systems. We operate on an academic schedule and the rest of the world does not. There's a lot of hurdles to sometimes go through. And so figuring out what are your non-negotiables in a partnership, what are the things that you know you need for your students, you need for your research proposal, et cetera. But then building in from the start, that space in the middle that can be determined together with whoever your partner is. We like to think a lot about what are your non-negotiables and what are the spaces where that list is maybe really long. So what does that mean for the type of project that you're thinking about and who your partner should be? And in a lot of ways, it's not very long. It's just a few simple things saying, I need somebody in an organization that is youth serving because my course is about youth, but students can do just about anything. In cases like that, there's a lot of opportunity for allowing co-creation to really bud up. And so I find that flexibility and communicating outside of the jargon of the literature of service learning and community engagement is most effective when you're working with partners, while at the same time not talking down to them of oh, what can I do for you? Or I want to do this with you because this is my positionality and I have this power and this ability to do it. But coming to a grassroots organization as a fellow human who cares about other humans and seeing where that relationship building can take you.
Thank you, Chelsea. I see that you've actually touched on one of the questions that has come up in the chat, which was about partnering with grassroots organizations as opposed to more formal nonprofits. So thank you for touching on that, but we can come back to that in more detail later as well. Okay, so next is Mary.
Again, I don't want to repeat what Chelsea just said so eloquently. And I think that relationship piece is really key. And my one piece of advice, which wasn't, it's not as deep, but it's take the time to go have a tea or a coffee with your community partner. And what I mean by that is that is have genuine conversation about things outside of the partnership, engage with, ask how people are doing, know, or when you have a meeting with one of your partners, book an extra hour or half an hour if you can, so that you can enjoy that time together and you're not rushing off to another meeting. I think another one that also what Chelsea said, and I've learned this from Brené Brown, if anyone's a fan, is clear is kind. There's like that, to be clear with your expectations, both what you have to get out of it and what you need, and know, so kind of knowing your boundaries, how much to take on. In my department, because we're called the Department of Community Development, we get a ton of calls and people wanting to work with us. And at a small institution like Acadia, we don't have a center of community engagement or teaching and learning yet, but I think it's coming. And so, the fact it's really faculty that are doing that work. I think that your office does so well, Chelsea. Language matters. I think you also mentioned that, Chelsea. Open to opportunities, so open to those synergies and to getting rid of the silos to work with your colleagues. So getting to know people on campus and I'm always amazed when I have a conversation with one of my colleagues in a different faculty or different department about the amazing work they're doing. And then there's always like a moment where I'm like, that connects to this thing that I'm doing. So being open to those types of conversations as well. And not being afraid of love, the word love, and loving and finding joy and hope in these things. Like, I think we need to not, bring love into this work. And I'll leave it there.
I love that, Mary. Thank you. Okay, now for Cynthia.
That's so interesting, because here I'm a political scientist. I self-identify as a policy analyst because of my interdisciplinary approach. And it's been interesting that I look at some of the books that are this computer stacked on: Compassion Fatigue, The Equity Myth, Willful Blindness, The Empathetic Civilization. These are all books that have informed and inspired me. And I have been using the word love in classes. And I'm remembering back in around 87, when I was a young professor, there was someone from the Harvard School of Business who was talking about how he was engaging his students in local communities. And the question then, as now, was, can you teach empathy? Fundamentally, and Chelsea said it beautifully, it is about personal relationships. And so, for example, just going back to the initial question, when I talked about the latest Nunavut Community Service Learning Initiative that involved several of my classes this fall, that started with Dr. Peter Irnuk, an Inuk elder and statesman. And it grew from there to include policy officials who are Inuit, including a young member of parliament at the time, Mumilat Kagak, 26 years old. And that moved to one of the fathers of Nunavut, Jack Anawak, who had also served as an ambassador and so on. That then grew and moved into connecting. This is all in 13 weeks, connecting with a small flying community. Because we were looking at the social determinants of health, but we didn't want to talk in that language of, well, this is what we want to study, we want to learn from you. We opened it up and we connected, yes, with the mayor of the hamlet, but we also connected with the school. And with the school, we connected with a group of high school students who are Inuk. And my students, I will never forget, it was the end of October. My students had been meeting every week in policy symposium virtually with the elders and the public officials.
I do. Yeah.
Oops, okay.
Yeah, I'll come find you.
Hi. Okay. And so we met for the first time with this group of high school students, and we were going to follow their lead. That's crucial. And what took our breath away almost was that these young high school students spoke to us without prompting about their experiences with respect to food insecurity, their personal experiences with the fact that Inuit have the highest rates of suicide, their experiences with the lack of housing and what that means in terms of tuberculosis, let alone the fact that it was their community that was in lockdown for over 100 days. And so my students, one of the key things that's so important I found is cultural safety. And one of the prerequisites that I include in my rubric for students now, in terms of how I how they'll self-assess how they're doing is cultural competence. And so there are ways that we engage with it, and it starts with me, and I need to model that behavior. So my students see my humility. And on this particular project, when we asked who are the experts when it comes to the social determinants of health, is it our former partner who's a well-known public health expert and has lived and worked in Nunavut? No. Is it me? No. It's Inuit. Is it only the Inuit elders? No, it's also those high school students. And they see me they see me unlearn. And I take time in class to correct myself publicly and all those other things. So what we're doing is co-learning respectfully. Thanks.
Thank you so much to our three panelists. Those were the three questions that I most wanted to ask you. But of course, we do have some great questions that are coming up in the chat as well. So I don't want to take too long with this because I want to make sure we have lots of time to discuss those great questions. But as a lot of you probably know, this webinar is one of the key capstones or outputs from a research project that CIRC and CC Canada have been doing over the last year and a half. And I do want to share with you, before we get into the Q&A, some of the just very preliminary insights that are coming out of this project, and to tell you a little bit about the research project. So, if you don't mind, I'll take just about 5 minutes to talk about that, and then we'll do the Q&A. Lots of the themes from our findings have already been mentioned, which is really, it's great to see that our comments and our findings are dovetailing in this way. I'll tell you a bit about our research project. So in late 2020, CIRC and CC Canada began a research project to develop recommendations to hopefully contribute to a more systematic community engaged learning program here at the University of Regina. And in order to do that, we wanted to draw from and learn from the best practices and effective practices that we were seeing happening across Canada, gathered from community-based organizations, from post-secondary institutions, and then to take those insights and lessons and tailor them to think about what we could do really well here at the U of R. And so the recommendations developed from the project do speak to the U of R, but they also speak more broadly to what's happening across Canada, what's really working for communities, for academics, for students. And we hope to be sharing those recommendations and insights through the CCE Canada network over the coming months. So the project itself did involve two parts. The first, of course, was a specific case study focused on U of R. For that, we actually built, it's a little bit meta, we actually built CEL into our project on CEL. So students from two of my classes participated in conducting interviews with very CEL active instructors and professors here at the University of Regina. And they also designed a survey instrument which surveyed students at the U of R about their feelings on community engaged learning. And that included students that both had and had not participated in CEL. So in total, we had interviews with 23 instructors and professors, and we had a total of 194 responses from students at the university talking about their feelings, very positive feelings overall on CEL. At the more pan-Canadian level, we've been involved with a comprehensive literature review and an environmental scan of many of the different programs and activities that are going on across the country, around the country. We also did interviews with 19 CEL practitioners, those with experience and knowledge to share on this topic. And we've been having a series of discussion sessions with community organizations as well. So we've been learning a lot about the many different challenges, opportunities, strengths, joy that can come from all of this. And we're very excited to share the final report with you within a few months. Here's just a few brief highlights of what we're learning so far. Many of these have already been discussed, but just to reiterate, finding number one was really about the importance of having infrastructure and resource support for CEL activities. So we recognized from our findings that there is a need for institutional responsibility, and that comes in the form of resources, infrastructure, support to really enable CEL to happen in a systematic but still a diverse way, to allow that flexibility to happen, to recognize those diverse objectives that different organizations will have, which has already been discussed. there was generally a commentary that CEL cannot be just an ad hoc effort that's done by individual instructors. It has to be a community effort, and there has to be a movement toward implementing this effectively within universities. It has to be a community and not just a collection of individuals that are doing this work. The second theme is very related to the first, and that is we really heard about the importance of valuing the work. What I'm sharing today is largely focused on the academics and the academic context. We also have other webinars that are happening which focus on the community context and on the boundary spanners, the CEL offices. But this session, of course, is focused on the academic institutions. And so one of the things we really heard from the professors, the instructors, the practitioners is that they want to do community engaged learning. They see the value in it, but they don't always feel supported or recognized in doing so. We also found that CEL is extremely well received by the students that have participated in it. They often said that it was much more valuable to them than their classes that did not have CEL components. But that definitely needs to be built into our formal performance review and recognition structures so that it gives, given, some of you have mentioned the time intensity of this, and some formal recognition of that could be a good motivator as well for recognizing the time spent in building these kinds of relationships and activities. And relatedly, the third theme that we're finding is really about building trust. This has already been mentioned, and I think this is so important, that recognition that building meaningful reciprocal relationships takes time. It has to start well in advance. It can't be just calling someone up the week before the class begins and saying, hey, we'd like to do something like this. What can we do? So that importance of building meaningful relationships. And then finally, a fourth theme to share with you that we're still working with is the importance of recognizing equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI considerations. Our conclusions here that we're forming are that we need a diverse range of CEL activities because students themselves are diverse. There is no idealized student subject, we might say, of community engaged learning, and students are going to have different needs and different considerations and different structural constraints that they're coming to this with. And I think that this finding as well poses a bit of a challenge to that neoliberal model of just quantification, quantity over quality, focusing on placements over relationships, which is neither community driven or student focused. And so I think that the importance of challenging that, and we heard a lot about questioning that very quantified model that doesn't always involve the meaningful relationships. And so that's just a very brief overview. Of course, we will be releasing a very large, very long report that goes into much more detail on many of these themes. And also, of course, we've recently had a webinar focused on the community perspectives, the community organizations. We have one coming up, which I'll be telling you about in a few moments, which is focused on the boundary centers, the CEL offices, etc. And we'll be taking up more of the findings from those two at those webinars. So I don't want to take up any more time. I want to make sure we have some time for questions. There are several that have already come up, so I'm just going to make sure that I haven't missed any of them. The first question, and this was from Brenda, is what activities or events have you found to be the most successful in connecting or engaging academics with community agencies and members? So maybe getting into, I know each of you has touched on this in different ways, but maybe if there's some specific activities that you could talk about, that would be great. And I'll just, whoever wants to speak, just feel free to go ahead.
One thing that my institution does and that my team does a lot of is bringing people together for, like, either we've called them critical friend groups, we've called them learning communities, we've called them curious dialogues, like spaces that are semi-structured, because it can be a little daunting to want to have to build this relationship, but like I've kind of described, it can be daunting to know where to start. And so having some sort of structure, but not so much structure that they're not able to connect and move around and discover where overlays may be and where that synergy is. So that's one thing. My team runs a lot of those, probably like 2 or 3 each academic year. And we see a lot of, and have seen a lot of people engage virtually and in person. And the other activity that I think is so trivial, but means so much is, and I think, Mary, you said this before, like if you think that you could talk about what you want to talk about in 30 minutes, schedule it for 45 or an hour, because the time that you spend doing introductions is oftentimes the richest part. You don't always have time for introductions when you have events that are 20 people deep and you only have an hour, but some sort of opportunity to do that, even if it's just in the chat or in little breakout rooms, I think that's where the magic happens.
Thank you, Chelsea. Mary or Cynthia, would you like to comment as well on any specific practices, strategies? It's okay if you don't.
Yeah, go ahead, Cynthia.
No, you go ahead, Mary, and then I will.
I don't have too much time because we don't have, like, I think from my perspective anyway, that we do a lot of this work on our own as faculty in Acadia. So we don't have, we're not gathering. But I think, like, what I have found more recently is when I already do have resources or funding, that's always a good in for organizations. And being fair, like being able to really compensate people well. So doing community engaged action research or feminist action research, pulling together a community advisory board, for example, to help with that research and engaging students in that work too. That networking with organizations to say, to pull in the ones that I already have connection to, and then they invite other people, and then it kind of it's a snowball effect from that. But putting at the center that it is led by community, and that there are resources so recognizing that as an institution, we need to bring resources into the community. So yeah, back to my money issue, I guess.
It's an important one, absolutely. Cynthia, for you?
I'm not sure this will address the question, but it's what's on my mind. In these past several decades, my students have engaged with community members to try to raise awareness about diverse issues that tend to be marginalized. And so, for example, every year since 2009, my students have worked with local First Nations community members and their nations across to recognize October 4th, which is the National Day of Vigils for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And many of our events are organized to be public, to try to connect other students, staff, and faculty, and senior administration, and local community members. So this last fall was such an intense community service learning immersion for me and my students. All my students participated, and we created a 5-day Mawiomi, which means gathering in Mi'kmaq, that started on September 21st, which was the first day in Canada, the National Day of Reconciliation. And it lasted all the way through, that was the 30th, all the way through to October 4th, the National Day. And we did things every day. We raised wigwams on campus in the local community. We ended up partnering with a local town. And what I did for the first time, because I've, as Mary knows, have been working with my students and other partners on campus and off campus, led by local First Nations partners, to create these Mawiomis and to make them, to ensure that we can open hearts and minds. And so we've brought in keynote speakers who from Candy Palmater to Richard Wagamis, and then a whole host of other things over many courses of days. And typically I would be a co-host to that. What I did for the first time at this Truth Before Reconciliation Mawiomi is I stepped way back. It's time, it was time my students were working for, as was I, so modeling behavior again, for Glooscap First Nation. And so in all the different opportunities over 5 days to speak, I didn't speak. And so that was an example. And I'll remember Portia White, a renowned African Nova Scotian opera singer. Her brother, Lauren White, was at a round table that my students organized in 2006 about African Nova Scotians and the need to diversify our campus. And what Lauren White said is, there's a need for door openers. And what I've learned as someone who's done this a long time is it's also important to know when to step back and be really behind the scenes, even though you're doing things equally, right? So I think I hope that answers the question in some way.
That's really helpful. Thank you to all of you. I'm mindful that we only have just a few moments left. There was a question that came up earlier in the session about engaging graduate students specifically in community engaged learning. And there's also a question about partnering with grassroots organizations as opposed to more formal organizations, formal nonprofits. So we sort of have both of those questions out there. I'd like to maybe turn both of those questions over to you at the same time, and you can answer one component or both, but over to you. So graduate students and grassroots organizations, what are your thoughts on engaging them?
I'll start.
Sure.
Tentatively. When I think of graduate students, and I just finished teaching a course that was a mixed class because we're a small liberal arts university that has small, in the Faculty of Arts, small graduate programs. I think one of the most important things, and it might have been Chelsea who talked to this, is such partnerships give students an awareness of why it's so important to learn to communicate in plain language and learn to communicate in multiple ways of knowing, and again, to make that community driven. So in that 2005 national conference where I was among the co-organizers who invited Inuit leaders to come and reflect on the first 5 years of Nunavut since it became a territory. One of the things that we heard, you heard what their priority was, but it was, how do you do that? And I'd been publishing all sorts of books, and I transitioned into listening to the need for ways of communicating that recognize and honor the oral tradition. That's when I partnered with Inuit, and we created the first ever interactive film. So I think those are experiences for graduate students to learn. I don't want to take more time, so I'll just leave it there, although I know I didn't fully answer the question.
Thank you, Cynthia. Chelsea?
Yeah, I think one thing I'd add about graduate students is that they're not a monolith. And so really understanding like what skill set those students are bringing into that engagement opportunity, and then tailoring the learning and the research opportunities to those skills, because some may be like continued education adult learners who are coming back. And so their skill set and their experiences are going to be really different than a just graduated from undergrad grad student. I think with grad students in particular, leveraging their experiences and their expertise that they're bringing into community engaged spaces, while also reminding them that there's still a lot of space for growth and for adapting their practices, is particularly important.
Thank you, Chelsea. And the final word goes to Mary. Is there?
Yeah, I agree with the other panelists, and that maybe that also to prioritize in graduate coursework action, research principles, and reflexivity. And so that just becomes part of whatever discipline it is. And I note that Laurie made a really great point around that nursing and social work, these service learning is embedded, it has been since, that's been part of their pedagogy for so long. And same with graduate work, like if we can embed in principles around reflexivity and action research, then I think that'd be really neat.
Well, I would like to thank all of you. I see that we're starting to lose some folks because, of course, it's the end of our session and we packed a lot into 1 hour. So much richness in the conversation. So I would like to thank all three of our panelists sincerely. Thank you so much for your time. It's a busy time of year. It's so appreciated. I would also like to just let everyone know that our next webinar in the series, the third, is coming up on May 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. That one is going to be focused on the boundary spanners, the CEL offices, etc. And it's called Building Connections for Community-Driven Research and Learning Partnerships. So there is a link to that information in the chat. Magda has posted it. And to learn more about this CEL project, you can email CCE Canada at info@ccecanada.ca. I would like to thank everyone so much for being here with us today, to thank Magda and Lynn as well for co-organizing this. And have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you so much to our panelists, and take care, everyone.